You're listening to Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, John Lawson.
I'm Matthew Fisher.
And this week we're joined by Jonathan Pietszch. I'll let him introduce himself in just a moment, but he is the current president of the South Australian Nationals Party. We're going to discuss a lot about regional issues, something which is a constant concern in Australian politics, considering the regions are such a power base of our country. They produce so much and are responsible for a lot of our exports. But welcome to the podcast, Jonathan. How are you going?
I'm going well, thanks. Thanks for having us along.
Yeah, no problem. Could you speak a little bit about your involvement in the National Party, and maybe you could talk about some of your primary issues, why you joined up and what you advocate for?
Sure. I've been a member of the National Party for a long time. I joined when I was 16. And for me, it was really the example of John Anderson and the character that he showed in public office that got me interested. I was interested in politics at the time and a city boy that wanted to go farming, but that was really what nudged me in the direction of the National Party. Been a member for a while now. It's been a bit of a varied journey. I've stood for Parliament a couple of times in a supporting role and in a primary role. Being in the South Australian Nationals, it's the smallest division of the party across the country. And there's some historical reasons for that, but it creates some opportunities, but it's always a challenge in our perspective, trying to advocate for, I suppose, the growth of the regions and for a conservative regional-based party being in the best position to advocate for our regional communities.
Yeah, so maybe apart from the size concern, what are some of the other major concerns in terms of growing the National Party down in South Australia?
Look, it's about getting that message out there, I think, and creating that reason. I think when in some of the other states where the party's been bigger and has demonstrated what it can do, it's a lot easier for people to look at it and recognise what the party is and what it can do. Whereas in South Australia, we're really, I suppose, fighting for that market share and also pointing particularly to what our federal guys do a fair bit as well. And you've only got to see that recently with the live sheep export debacle that's just unfolded with the decimation of livelihoods both in WA and right across the country from the stroke of the government's pen. So,
Yeah, 100%. And is that a key part of South Australia's exports and manufacturing?
Yeah,
Well, not manufacturing, but economic base?
Yeah, look, I suppose from a South Australian perspective, we're not in the direct export by boat of live sheep. But the knock-on effect, we saw it when the government killed the Northern Territory live export for cattle, immediate price drops. We've seen it recently with the shenanigans in WA with more and more livestock being imported across the state borders. So it's affecting local markets. It provides some opportunity, but it's really destroying livelihoods for no other reason than to try to appease some inner city voters that don't seem to understand that our live sheep export market and the way we do things is the best in the world. And look, there was a time 15, 20 years ago where some things weren't being done right, and we've always owned up to that. Not too many other places around the globe that require the welfare standards of their point of origin to be followed right the way through the supply chain. So it's a pretty cruel thing what the Labor government's just done in ruining the live export trade.
Well, you sort of touched on a dynamic that I see developing where we have this growing distance between rural and city, you could say voters, but also just citizens. Is this something that you see getting worse over time as a function of the cities getting bigger and thus having more market sway over government? Or do you see that something that's going to get better over time as perhaps the regions slowly grow?
Look, I think it's something that can get better if we actually actively campaign for it. I think, I've certainly noticed that one of the things that we've done over a period of time is have vet students on the farm as part of their practical experience. And in a decade, I've noticed the disconnect between an understanding of the industry that puts food on plates, and the consumer, and really picked that up watching some of their journeys and some of their self-discovery as they've been working with us. But I think, I believe you guys have done a bit of a podcast on it recently, but Clarkson's Farm has been one of the best eye-openers for the average layman in terms of seeing some of that struggle and the heartache that goes into it, and humanising the food production process. Because it's probably as bad as it's ever been in our nation's history, that the centralisation of people into the cities and a disconnect between the paddock and the plate.
Well, yeah, there's generally this squeamishness surrounding, I suppose you could say, animals in general, but it's even extended to the animals that we put in our mouth eventually. I guess this is a function of us being more separate from nature. Well, at least those who live in the cities being more separate from the origin of their food, and not actually being involved in or knowing anyone that's involved in the production of that food and what is required to do it. People are perfectly content to eat the food at the end of that, but aren't concerned with the economics of getting that delivered or the livelihood of those who are delivering it. And yeah, you're right. We mentioned Clarkson's Farm in a recent episode with a Western Australian farmer slash historian, and he was talking about how it does definitely seem like there is this deliberate push to really reduce the number of farmers and just deplete the industry overall across the Western world. And this comes through lots of environmental regulation, like you've mentioned before, sort of overabundant animal rights regulations, some stuff that goes a little bit too far, is a little bit silly, as well as general just diminishing of sort of that independent lifestyle that you get when you live out in the country, and a greater centralization with more and more people being packed into the cities. That's where all the jobs are going, and people just really hollowing out from the regions. The result has been, at least from the report from that farmer, quite detrimental. It's been catastrophic for the regions. And when I do visit, I must confess I spend most of my time in the city, but when I do visit any sort of part outside of the city, I see that these small country towns are generally, they seem to have an aging population problem, where a lot of people are middle-aged or older, and I guess that is probably a function of there not being a lot of opportunities, education, or jobs out there. Nothing to attract people to stay. Certainly not wages high enough for that reason. What are some of the pressures that you see, Jonathan, on those farmers, and why are all the young people moving out of the rural areas and into the cities?
Look, I think there's actually been a bit of a reversal in the last few years, and COVID's had a fair bit to do with that, that there's actually been a push back into the regions, people looking at the cost of living. Now, certainly the cost of food, for instance, is dearer, but the cost of buying your first home in the country regions is a lot cheaper than the city. So I think there's some real upside stories that we need to look at, and really that cost of home ownership, the Australian dream, is probably the primary driver for why people should be looking to move out of the country. But we're really seeing the tale of two different towns, or two different cities, I suppose, that if there's an industry that drives growth in a particular town, it often does well. And once a town gets over a certain population base, it can generally self-sustain. But there are still plenty of those smaller towns that are that don't have that industry coming in, or don't have that local employer to underpin them, that means they drop back a bit. But look, services, the ability to get a medical appointment, it's a big one that we're fighting for locally here in Tintinara, where services that were taken for granted and accepted as being the way of doing things 10 years ago no longer are. And that's a rationalisation, often out of bureaucracy, often based in a city or based in a large regional city town. Look, I think it's not all doom and gloom. In terms of the agricultural space, the cost of equity, the cost of buying is a big problem for young people. You need a lot of money now to get into farming without having something behind you. But there's certainly been an uptick in the younger generation being involved in farming from an employee space, and with some of the more vertically integrated livestock companies too that are starting to grow, and looking for opportunities for growth in regional towns on major stock routes and so forth, I think we'll see some growth there as well. But yeah, coming back to that first point I make is that if you're a young family, you're looking to get into your own property to not pay rent. One of the best things you can do is look outside of a metropolitan area and look at getting into a country town.
I think one of the concerns, or some of the concerns that many people have with following that plan, is that we've touched on it, is that there are fewer jobs, but also there's a problem with medical care access, just emergency services in general, as well as, I guess, it's a massive lifestyle change. When you go out of the city, there's just generally less options in terms of entertainment, in terms of various things. Family sometimes isn't out there. What would be some of the ways that we could improve that shift, or make the rural areas or these smaller towns more appealing to people so that they would willingly relocate and rejuvenate the regions?
I think one of the things that people have realised through that COVID era is that it's not that far to travel. And when I say that travelling from where we are into Adelaide is 2 hours, Murray Bridge to Adelaide is now. It's not that far to go, particularly in South Australia, from a major regional centre to the city. So I think reframing that in terms of how long is it going to take me to drive from one side of Adelaide to the other versus how long is it going to take me to drive from Murray Bridge to the tollgate. I think people have just started to think through that a bit more. But I think there's some really great things about regional towns, about people coming together, volunteering. And I think one of the things that needs to happen is as people come in, the culture of the town, and that's really up to those that already live there, is to bring them into the clubs, bring them into the organisations and say, hey, this is how we help each other out. This is how we work together to make sure that those services are here. But it really does come back to a bit of a chicken and egg situation that without the people, the services diminish. But it's hard to get those people to come out there when the services aren't there. So I think some policy around structured growth, possibly some zonal taxation, which has always been a thing the national parties like to push over the time, to incentivise people to say, yeah, you should be out here. It's a great place to raise a family, and we recognise there's some limitations, but we'll try to make it better. And again, I just come back to that, the cost of owning a house. If the cost is half, you can live with a slightly less of a salary, or there's some other things you can cope with if the primary function of keeping a roof over your head is a lot cheaper.
So what were the big drivers behind you choosing to move out of the city and into the country?
Look, big driver for me, like I've wanted to be a farmer since a very young age. From the first time I experienced it, I was hooked. So I've chased that dream, and I've dragged my whole family out here. We're all regionally based now in South Australia. But it's a question I've then had to re-ask myself as we've had children, and you look at that tyranny of distance thing and say, is it worth it? And 100% it is. The lifestyle you can have out here, the open space, there's things my kids now take for granted that I wish we'd had as kids growing up. So yeah, it's I wouldn't say it's for everybody, but there's a lot to be gained and a lot of benefit from being in a small town, from being in a small community, and from being able to work with people to achieve outcomes that grow the town.
Matthew, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, we've heard a lot over the past couple of weeks when we've talked to people in regional Australia around the opportunities that are presented there. So when you move out to these towns, there's a lot more, like you were talking about, clubs and social groups that you can be involved with, and you have a greater sense of a community and like a neighbourhood and people who care about you. Has this been your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've in a country town, you do have to put yourself out there a bit. You've got to be prepared to look for that opportunity a bit. But the sense of family, the sense of belonging that you have in a small regional community is something I don't think you see too many other places. It's an interesting question, actually, because I recently did a toast for the Lions Club and looked at this question with them. And what is it that defines us as people from Tintinara? Is it the fact that we're from this tiny geographic space? Or is it more about the culture of the town that makes people say with pride that we're from Tintinara? Is it the can-do attitude, the achieving change without asking for permission, just going ahead and doing what's the best for the community, that actually brings about that sense of identity? And I think it's both. It's geographic, but it's also about the culture that's been created by those that came before and those that have taken it on now.
This is certainly worth noting, considering the way that Australian culture is being changed very rapidly, and especially as of recent. I think a large part of that is the mass immigration, something that the Liberal Party has mentioned bringing down. Is this something that you have noticed affecting the culture of country towns as well, whether positive or negative? Or is that something that you still see is mainly relegated to the cities?
Oh, look, I would say that immigration in the regions is actually a net benefit. We've got some fantastic immigrants in town that have really stepped into the culture of the town. Our local, the owner of this local supermarket, he's an Indian gentleman, and he has just been fantastic for our town. Right through COVID, he kept the stock shelved, and he's really formed a part of who we are today. And my wife's originally from Zimbabwe, but I can't really speak too much to, I suppose, the city experience. But just to note that my experience has been that the people that end up staying in regional Australia as immigrants are the people that genuinely want to be here and genuinely want to be part of who we are. So I think that's that's been a positive experience for our town.
And just circling back to the community engagement, is that part of the reason why you did join the National Party, to represent your community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think politics is two-sided. It's representing the people representing the people you seek to represent. It sounds a bit twee, but it's also being a representative with a vision and a focus around that forward-looking piece and what you want to see your community, whether it's the macro or the micro, look like going forward. I think the Nationals have a vision for regional Australia from a conservative viewpoint that reflects the regional Australia I want my kids to be a part of. But I've also got a responsibility to ensure that the party stays focused on being that space going forward.
And just on the National Party, we've seen in recent decades they've been relegated to junior partners of the coalition, and this is a rather large fall from grace from when they controlled the Queensland Parliament with Joe Bjelke-Petersen. Do you see any path forward for the National Party to reassert itself as a large political force?
Look, I think we are, and we are always going to be a party in the demographic of Australia that isn't the largest. We have a particular focus on the regions, and the numbers are what they are. The regional seats, particularly in our federal parliament, are capped at where they are. But we have to do a better and better job at really standing up for those communities and ensuring that we hold all those seats. That the justification for our existence is there. And I think in the last, particularly the last 18 months, we've really seen the National Party step forward and drive some of the policy decisions that have come out of the federal coalition. whether that's from taking the principled position to oppose the voice in the first instance to driving the nuclear debate. And that came from a motion from South Australia. It came from a motion from the Queensland Nationals. It came from the grassroots of the party saying that we want you, our federal team, to take on the nuclear energy debate as being something that's better for the whole country. And I think you're seeing it again now, even this week, with the Federal Coalition's announcement of a policy to rein in the power of the supermarkets. That's come from us. And I think it's important to recognise that the Nationals play a pretty big role in driving the policy agenda, even if we are the smaller of the two parties.
That's understandable. And generally it seems like the Nationals have been more conservative on net over time, and it's good to have that voice of reason oftentimes when the Liberals can swing a little bit too far to the left. Can you think of, well, I'll mention there was recently that little tiff in between Marcus Speakman's and also the other fella from the National Party in New South Wales, Wes Fang, and that led to a barrage of media articles about the coalition potentially having a rift and being in danger of breaking up. Do you see any threat of that happening? Do you see that the Nationals benefiting from that? Or do you think that the coalition is better together?
Look, I think I won't comment too much on the particulars of what happened when Mr. Speakerman came to Wagga and didn't let the local MP know. I think that highlighted that Mr. Speakerman probably should have spoken to his coalition partner before putting out press releases. But I think if we just go back a bit more broadly at the coalition federally and as it exists in the states, and I think something to understand is the coalition is an agreement between the leaders of two parties. The coalition is renewed after every election in a federal sense. But I know there are certain areas that I would say are fundamental to the Nationals and what we believe, and that if a decision was ever taken to move away from those areas or to cross them, I think at that point in time, our federal leadership team would then look at the coalition and assess that. And I think Live Exports, David Littleproud's made this pretty clear that the reinstatements of Live Exports is a line in the sand for the National Party, and it will be integral to support going forward. So I think coalitions serve a purpose, but they have to be looked at as a two-way relationship, and they're best served with give and take on both sides. But I think in them, it's very important for us going forward that we recognise our core values in any decisions taken through a coalition arrangement.
What are the meaningful differences apart from the Live Exports issue that separates the members of the coalition, the Nationals and Liberals? I know, for example, the Nationals tend to be a little bit more protectionist in terms of trade and economics. Is this a stereotype or is this true?
No, I think the protectionism is a stereotype. Most National Party folk that you'd find now are very much free market orientated, but I think there would also be a caveat with that I think people from the National Party would say, we believe in the free market. We want to see the free market outcome, but the playing field has to be level for that to occur. That we've seen in the past when our people, our farmers, have been thrown in the deep end through chasing the ideology of free marketeering, that it doesn't end well for regional communities. So I suppose the overarching mantra of the National Party is, how do we put our community first? What are we doing to ensure that in taking the decision for the greater good, we're making sure that the marginalised and the small folk in our country towns are still able to get ahead.
You mentioned that there's a lot of alignment with the Liberal and National parties. And as we saw in Queensland in 2008, there was a merger between the two parties to form one anti-Labor party. Do you see that being a benefit in South Australia or more broadly across Australia if that were to occur?
No, 100% not. Look, the Queensland model worked for Queensland in terms of getting around the constant media speculation about who the next premier might be, with the party numbers being so close between the National and Liberal parties up there. But even in the LNP, when they come to Canberra, they sit in two different party rooms. And I don't think fundamentally it's in the country's interest to have a merged party across the country. I think having the National Party as the regional conscience of the parliament is for the greater good. That if you don't have a group of people there arguing for those who make up the largest geographic base of this country, but the smallest population base, and you got to look at that. The population is really where the power of politics is, and if you don't have that grouping of regional conservatives saying, no, this is not what our communities need, and coming together in that capacity, I think we'd all be worse off for it. So no, I would always argue for the ongoing existence of the National Party.
Fair enough. To shift gears a little bit, maybe we can dive a little bit into what makes the National Party a little bit more conservative. Particularly, I know that you're a strong defender of family values. This is something that has come under attack as of recent, probably within the last few decades, most noticeably, and it's only accelerating over time. We have, generally speaking, the intrusion of ideology into the classroom, more so maybe in the city than in the country, but could you touch on some of these influences and what the National Party is doing to combat them, please, Jonathan?
Yeah, I can certainly talk to it. Like the National Party is fundamentally a conservative organisation, and I think the way David Littleproud frames us as being the party of common sense, and I don't know. I think we've just seen the world shift very quickly from things that would have been seen as fairly out there only a decade, 15 years ago, to being mainstream now. I think you've got to look at the objects of our party, which is to promote a society based on Christian ethics and loyalty to the Crown. And that's, I suppose, the lens that we broadly try to approach issues through. That decision-making is best made locally, that the family unit really is the fundamental building block of society. And I think our communities benefit by maintaining that as the fundamental building block. So, yeah, I'm not sure if I've answered the question in that one, but I think that's the approach that we would come at things from.
And we here would agree 100% with that. You know, the family is the most important building block of society, and for too many people, it's this focus on individualism, what's good for the individual, rather than what's good for families. So, is there anything specifically in the National Party platform that you wouldn't see in any other parties that would help, young people have families? Because we see all these news articles around young people with, having a family is too unaffordable, or, the cost of childcare, all this kind of stuff. So is there anything specific that you guys are trying to target?
Look, I think that cost of living question is a constant one. And I think you can see that this week from the looking at the duopoly of the supermarkets and what that means both at the farming end and price gouging there, and then taking that through to the family. But I think it's that constant focus on how do we make things better for our communities. Cost of living is multifaceted. I don't know about you guys, but I've certainly been experiencing it lately. But we need to be able to create opportunities that, I don't know, one of the things I find quite peculiar is how quickly as a society we've gone to a space where you need to have a dual income in order to beat the cost of living. But that then poses all these other questions of childcare, and without the nuclear family around you, how do you look to support your children? And if you don't have grandparents and aunts and uncles close by, how do you make all that work? So I suppose if I look at it and I come back to the grassroots questions, the Nats, what are the sort of motions that I see people putting forward to try to deal with that? Well, zonal taxation. I'll get shot for saying this one because it's one that comes up regularly, and I think it's one that most members would agree with. But income splitting between husband and wife. So I think in terms of just how we approach things, it really is, how do we look after those people in our communities? How do we make sure that their way of life can continue going forward? And how do we ensure that a decent income is enough to live on?
Yes, absolutely. And while these sort of material concerns are very concerning, I guess I repeat myself there, but while these material concerns are very preeminent in people's minds, the moral concerns as well is something that unfortunately doesn't get addressed as much, but I would argue is certainly more pressing, although it may not seem so at the time. I believe you're a Lutheran, Jonathan. Matthew and I are both Christians, and I think that more concerning is the attack on the church and on the church's teachings surrounding various moral questions. I think that, for example, the putting on of these drag queen story times, for example, in public libraries and sometimes just in other locations as well, these are pretty gross displays of something that shouldn't be shown to children and is honestly quite repugnant to a Christian sensibility. Um, this is something that is unfortunately on the trend upwards. It's more so pressing from the perspective of online content rather than I don't know how many parents actually taking their kids to see these shows, although they are a real world example of something which is quite obnoxious. However, the online content is something which is a big problem, and we've heard in recent weeks calls for so I wouldn't call it censorship, but certainly more protections online from this sort of harmful content, whether it be pornographic, whether it be to do with ideology. Do you support this sort of legislation, and does the National Party also?
Yeah, look, it's certainly been a topic of discussion. I know it came up as a motion at the recent New South Wales conference and was supported there. I do support it. I always ask the question, how do you police something like that? But I do think that what we have the potential to expose our children to is pretty horrific at the moment. But I also do believe that fundamentally it is a responsibility as parents to ensure that the environment we're bringing our kids up in is a safe one, and that we do need to take responsibility to the best of our ability to ensure that our children aren't exposed to things that we believe aren't appropriate. And I suppose that's what I was getting at earlier when I talk about that shifting of values over a decade, over 15 years. I don't think if you went back 15 years and said we were talking about drag shows in libraries, people would have believed you, to be quite frank. So, yeah, look, I'm watching the space around online safeguards with interest. I think there is a potential for that to become a censorship issue. But the underpinning belief that our children need to be protected is obviously the paramount one. So I think there's some policy debate, which as a party we're looking at to go in terms of where we land with that.
Yeah, I like the distinction that you made between the danger of overstepping into censorship in trying to block a lot of the harmful content, one part that I know Albanese mentioned is that he grouped together what you could probably describe as ideologically opposed content to his government and to the left-wing worldview. For example, things that promote masculinity, he grouped that in with other forms of harmful content, such as porn. And he says that these two are, he almost equated them by saying that they both need to be shut down, censored, or banned. Now, on the one hand, I'd say that yes, the porn is absolutely that is something that should be banned. The Christian religion is pretty black and white on that issue. It's not something that is beneficial to people. It breaks up families. It's damaging to the soul. Well, on the other hand, it's important that we be promoting masculine virtue and self-reliance and so on to young men as well. I don't think that the two should be grouped together. And I like the point that you made that we need to make sure that doesn't veer into censorship of that kind of content. Oftentimes, extreme examples are used to justify these sorts of policies. People will say this one particular person is saying something outrageous, and so therefore we need to, shut down the internet and make sure that no young man ever sees something like this because it's going to radicalize them and so on and so forth. However, that is it's a very ideologically tainted way of looking at things. It's certainly not objective, and if you've got a internet censor such as the one that we have at the moment going around and shutting down at their own whim, you can easily see how this will border into tyranny and into something that is very damaging to the growth of conservative ideas and right-wing thought. And what would be a way that you reckon it would be you'd be able to tread that line? Would it mean that you'd have to appoint more people who have to consult on what is to be censored, or would it be something that may incorporate AI? What do you think would be the solution?
I'll just put my personal view across here. I'll make it clear it's my personal view. I believe in free speech, and I think any time you qualify free speech with a but, we've got a problem because it's no longer free speech. I think, and if I look at this from the fundamentals of how the National Party would try to do something, this should be about empowering parents. This should be about empowering caregivers to say, here are the tools that you can implement to protect your kids. Here's the baseline as a society that we accept, that we believe is here, but this is how you can go about using these tools to ensure that your kids are only exposed to things that you want them to be. I think you highlighted it just then. The issue with that censorship stick is it depends on who's in power. It depends on who's wielding it as to what is deemed to be unacceptable. And I would much rather see tools placed at the fingertips of parents than any other approach.
I think
that's understandable. It's a very decentralized way of looking at things. Matthew, did you want to follow up?
I think just to counter to that is that, there are parents out there that don't have perfect knowledge of what their children are up to. Some don't understand the nature of the internet, or some might not just care about their kids. And do we not, as a country, as a people, have a moral duty to those children with parents who maybe don't do the right thing all the time? So is there something else we can do for those situations?
Yeah, look, absolutely, and I think that's the point I was making about the baseline of what's acceptable. There has to be a conversation around the danger and the damage that things like pornography can do to young people. I just get very nervous when we see, as we've seen with the current government, the lumping in of many issues into one, and small government is always better than large. So don't necessarily, I'm not saying I've got the complete answer for this one, but I do think empowering the nuclear family to make a decision is the fundamental building block that I'd always start with. And yeah, some parents don't get it. Some parents don't understand how quickly the internet's moved and social media. And but I think there's a conversation that can be had about where things are at in order to protect others. And I think that's probably where I'd leave it for that one.
Yeah, well, the defense of free speech is absolutely essential. It's especially concerning because censorship online has grown from private companies. In fact, I think it would be the duty of the government, as opposed to what is being done today, rather than trying to shut down free speech and people's expression of ideas, especially in the political realm. They should be considering something like an Internet Bill of Rights or some sort of protection for, or formal legislated protection for people's expression of their ideas and thoughts. Thankfully, Twitter has recently been bought out by Elon Musk, turned into X, and he has extended free speech much further than it was previously afforded to users. And this has opened up a lot of discussion and the advancement of many conservative right wing ideas, which I would say has been extremely productive. It's been very beneficial in the long run, and it's forced even some other social media platforms to reconsider their policies in terms of censoring users. But yeah, I agree. The essential part is that free speech has to be protected, and we should probably veer to or at least err on the side of caution in terms of any sort of censorship. Nonetheless, the sort of ideologies that are being promoted at the moment, I'm thinking of the sort of poisonous LGBT ideology, was something that was very strongly opposed in the same-sex marriage debate by Nationals leaders such as Barnaby Joyce. Do you think that the general atmosphere of the Australian right wing, the National Party, the Liberal Party, has gotten better or worse on that issue over time, Jonathan?
I think it's been a pendulum, to be honest. Um, Fundamentally, I still believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. And as a Christian, when Christ, the relationship between Christ and the church is spoken about in terms of marriage, I think it's quite important that um, our core belief around that stays the same. Um, I think there's been probably a bit more of a realization in the last few years that if you don't stand up to some of the ideas coming from the left, they'll overrun you. And I think the conversations we're able to respectfully have around the voice as a party, noting that some within our ranks did disagree with us, but to say fundamentally we're all one, and our racial background shouldn't have any bearing on our involvement in politics, and that our Aboriginal members and senators are there to represent their entire communities, not just the Aboriginal community. So I
Sorry to
think,
interrupt, but The Voice is a perfect example of how these sorts of calls for censorship were exploited by the Albanese government at the time. They were calling everything that disagreed with The Voice misinformation and dangerous extremism in some cases, when clearly that wasn't the case. There are many well-founded and well-founded reasons to oppose The Voice, and it was represented by many reputable people. But sorry, I'll let you continue on, Jonathan.
yeah, and I think that's something that David Littleproud particularly highlighted in the way he respectfully went about engaging. Is it's not okay to call somebody um, extreme for having an opposing viewpoint, and that applies very much to our side of politics as it does to the left. I think one of the things we are really missing is the respectful dialogue and engagement of ideas. Um, the polarisation of politics, uh, it's just become so hard to have a decent conversation now. I'm probably broadly brushing here, but there's some great people on both sides who can um, respect the difference and see the betterment that the other person's aiming for. But I think the ability to have a measured conversation that explores a debate fully, uh, that ability has just been wiped out by our very short news cycle, and by the way that politics has gone. And I think Albanese was completely out of line for the way um, some of those characterisations were made. But I think it's about the better amongst us, coming back and saying no. We can disagree on this matter. We still respect you. We still can understand where you're coming from, but our core belief says that this is not okay. And that's middle ground. That's not the extreme. That's common sense. So I think reframing the debate to highlight the common sense nature of it is something that the centre and centre right of politics really needs to look at.
I think that the Voice was a great symbolic victory for the right wing in Australia in that, I mean, at one point it didn't look at all like we had any chance of winning. All of the celebrities came out on the side of the Voice. And at the end of the day, I guess it was, everyone, well, a majority of the population saw through it and they ended up rejecting it, which was a resounding victory. I think that really marks I think it should mark the foundation of a new right wing in Australia, one that's unapologetic and is willing to push through on these issues, which were once considered extremely controversial. And if we do so, we can win, and we can win resoundingly. But thank you for joining us this week, Jonathan. I think we're approaching the end of the episode. Would you like to tell people where they can find your content, or the party, or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So look, there's plenty on Facebook, both in personal page and South Australian Nationals. So yeah, that's probably the best place to find anything up to date. But no, thanks for having me, guys. And I think being able to, just going back to that point you're just making, that being able to reframe the debate away from the extremity is what worked in The Voice. It was saying that the idea that we should all be equal under our Constitution is not something that's revolutionary. This is a basic fundamental of what it should be to be Australian. And I think when our side of politics starts to step back from the hyperbole and actually go, no, we're just being common sense here. This is not extreme. This is just common sense. That's when we can win these arguments.
Yep, absolutely agree. Thank you for joining us this week, Jonathan. Matthew, would you like to tell the audience where they can find more of our content?
Certainly. Go onto Google, type up thenationalobserver.co. You'll find everything there. And catch our podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the YouTube. Type in The National Observer, subscribe, share it with your nan, share it with your brothers and sisters, share it with your friends, share it with your girlfriend if you're a fake cell who's listening. Thanks, Jonathan, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great rest of your week.